I knew something was wrong the second I saw the HOA president, Margaret Whitmore, standing on my front lawn with her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. She always had that air of superiority, like she was a queen ruling over her little suburban kingdom. But today she looked particularly pleased with herself, which meant bad news for me. "Zachary," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "we need to talk about the tree removal." I frowned. What tree removal? Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh as if I was some clueless child. "The oak tree on the corner of your property. It had to be cut down. It was a hazard." I glanced toward the spot where the massive tree had stood for decades. Sure enough, all that remained was a jagged stump and a mess of wood chips littering my lawn. That tree had been perfectly healthy the last time I checked. "Who gave permission for that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The HOA board, of course." She tilted her chin up. "We determined it was a danger to the sidewalk, liability issues." I folded my arms. "You mean you determined you didn't like how it looked?" Margaret ignored my comment and handed me an envelope. "Here's the bill, $4,000 for the removal." I blinked. "Excuse me." She smiled like she'd just caught me in a trap. "Since the tree was technically on the edge of your property, the cost falls on you. Standard HOA policy." I took the envelope but didn't bother opening it. I already knew I wasn't paying a dime. "Let me get this straight. You decided to cut down my tree without asking me, and now you expect me to pay for it." Margaret's smile faltered. "This is non-negotiable, Zachary. The board has made its decision." I let out a short laugh. "Well, here's my decision. I'm not paying." Her face turned a shade of red that rivaled a stop sign. "You'll regret this," she snapped before stomping off down the sidewalk. I had no doubt she'd try to make my life miserable, but what she didn't realize was that I wasn't going to just sit back and take it. Margaret and her little HOA goons had just made a big mistake, and I was about to make sure they paid for it. I wasn't about to let Margaret and her HOA cronies get away with this. They had trespassed onto my property, destroyed a perfectly healthy tree, and then had the audacity to bill me for it. That wasn't just overreach, it was outright illegal. The first thing I did was grab my phone and call my buddy James. He was a property lawyer, and if anyone could tell me exactly how badly the HOA had screwed up, it was him. After a brief rundown of the situation, he let out a low whistle. "They cut down a tree on your property without your permission and then tried to make you pay for it," James said, clearly amused. "They just made your case a whole lot easier." I asked him what my next move should be. James advised me to check the HOA bylaws, local property laws, and city ordinances. If the HOA had violated property rights, which they almost certainly had, I could take legal action. After hanging up, I pulled up the HOA's governing documents. I'd kept a copy from when I moved in, though I doubted Margaret had ever expected anyone to actually read them. Sure enough, I found exactly what I was looking for. Any changes to a homeowner's property required written consent from the owner. No exceptions. That was my first piece of ammunition. Next, I searched city ordinances regarding tree removal. As it turned out, my town had strict laws about cutting down mature trees, especially without proper permits. The HOA hadn't just overstepped their authority, they had likely broken the law. I was already feeling confident, but then I checked property records and got my biggest break yet. That tree had been officially recorded as part of my property. The HOA had no legal claim over it at all. With everything lined up, I decided it was time to escalate this in a way Margaret wouldn't see coming. The next morning, I visited City Hall and filed a formal complaint about unauthorized tree removal. The clerk raised an eyebrow as I explained the situation. She asked for documentation, which I gladly provided. When I mentioned the HOA had billed me for the destruction, she shook her head. "They can't do that," she said, "and if they cut it down without a permit, the city's going to want to have a word with them." That was exactly what I was counting on. By the time I got home, I had already received an email from the city's urban forestry department. They were launching an investigation into the tree removal. Any fines associated with unlawful removal would be directed at whoever authorized it. Margaret was about to have a very bad day. That afternoon, I saw her walking down the street, clipboard in hand, probably looking for her next victim. I decided to wait. The less she knew about what was coming, the better. 2 days later, I got a front row seat to the fallout. A marked city vehicle pulled up in front of Margaret's house, and 2 officials stepped out. One of them was holding a folder probably filled with paperwork related to the investigation. They knocked on her door, and when she answered, I could see her stiffen. The conversation was too far away for me to hear, but the body language told me everything I needed to know. Margaret's confident posture slowly melted into one of barely contained panic. She gestured wildly, probably trying to argue her way out of it, but the city officials weren't having any of it. It wasn't long before they handed her some papers, likely citations or notices for a hearing. Margaret snatched them out of their hands before slamming the door. I didn't have to wait long to find out just how much trouble she was in. That evening, I got an email from James, who had been keeping tabs on the legal side of things. The city was fining the HOA several $1,000s for unauthorized tree removal, failure to obtain a permit, and trespassing onto private property. But the best part, since Margaret had signed off on the removal, she was personally liable for some of the penalties. I could only imagine how furious she must have been. The next day, I got a letter from the HOA. I expected it to be another attempt to pressure me into paying their ridiculous bill. Instead, it was an official notice stating that the fine had been rescinded and I was no longer responsible for any costs. They had folded. Not only that, but word had spread through the neighborhood about what had happened. Homeowners who had been dealing with Margaret's nonsense for years suddenly had the courage to push back. An emergency meeting was called to discuss her leadership, and it didn't take long for people to start demanding a new president. Margaret had spent years lording over this community, thinking she was untouchable, but this time she had made a mistake too big to cover up. And I had made sure she paid for it. Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. After the city slapped her with fines and the HOA members started questioning her leadership, I knew she'd be looking for a way to regain control. What I didn't expect was just how desperate she'd get. The day after the emergency HOA meeting, I was outside fixing my mailbox when I spotted Margaret pacing in front of her house, phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was tight, her gestures sharp. She was clearly arguing with someone. I had a feeling it had to do with the growing rebellion among the homeowners. Less than an hour later, my doorbell rang. Expecting a delivery, I casually opened the door only to find Margaret standing there, arms crossed, a forced smile stretched across her face. She wasted no time getting to her point. She claimed that the HOA had reviewed my situation and out of goodwill had decided to drop the issue entirely. I held back a laugh. The fines and city intervention had already forced them to back down, but now she was trying to spin it as if they were doing me a favor. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting for what I knew was coming next. Margaret wasn't the type to admit wrongdoing without trying to twist things in her favor. Sure enough, she quickly shifted gears, saying that we needed to move forward as a community and that tensions were bad for morale. Then she got to her real point. She suggested that I make a public statement saying the entire tree situation was a misunderstanding. She wanted me to clear her name. I stared at her for a moment, genuinely stunned by the audacity. After everything she had done, she thought I would help her save face. I told her no, plain and simple. Her mask of politeness cracked for a brief second, but she quickly recovered, telling me in a clipped tone that she hoped I wouldn't regret my decision. I shut the door in her face. That should have been the end of it, but Margaret wasn't done. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail, another fine. This time, the HOA claimed that my lawn was not in compliance with community standards. They attached a blurry photograph of a small patch of clover in my front yard. I had mowed my lawn just days ago, and it was in perfect shape. This was clearly retaliation. I wasn't the only one getting hit with nonsense violations. My neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who had spoken out against Margaret at the emergency meeting, suddenly received a notice about her driveway having visible cracks. Another resident, who had also voiced his complaints, was fined for having his trash bins out too early. It was obvious what was happening. Margaret was trying to intimidate anyone who stood against her. That was her next mistake. I wasn't about to let this slide, so I started gathering evidence. I took timestamp photos of my lawn, showing it was well maintained. I spoke to Mrs. Patel and the other residents who had been targeted, documenting their experiences. Then I reached out to James again, telling him about the sudden wave of retaliatory fines. He advised me to file a formal complaint with the state's homeowner protection agency. But I had an even better plans. I had already seen how quickly the city got involved when laws were broken. So I went a step further and contacted the local news. A reporter named Lisa from the investigative journalism team was very interested in the story. I sent her all the documentation I had: Margaret's unauthorized tree removal, the city's fines against the HOA, and now the pattern of harassment against homeowners. Lisa told me she would start digging. It didn't take long for things to spiral out of Margaret's control. A week later, a news van rolled into the neighborhood. Lisa and her cameraman knocked on several doors, interviewing residents about their experiences with the HOA. Margaret must have gotten word because she suddenly appeared, attempting to shut down the interviews, claiming that they were trespassing on private property. Lisa shut her down immediately, stating that they were on public streets and had every right to be there. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red, but she had no choice but to retreat. That night, the story aired on the evening news. The report didn't hold back. It detailed Margaret's abuse of power, the illegal tree removal, the city fines, and the sudden wave of retaliatory fines against homeowners who had spoken out. They even interviewed a former HOA board member who admitted that Margaret often pressured the board into making decisions without proper votes. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, several residents were gathered outside, discussing the news segment. Many of them had been dealing with Margaret's nonsense for years but had been too afraid to push back. Now, with everything exposed, they were ready to act. A petition was started to remove Margaret as HOA president. Within hours, over half the neighborhood had signed it. Margaret must have realized she was losing control because she attempted one last desperate move. That afternoon, 2 police officers arrived in the neighborhood. Word spread fast, and soon a small crowd had gathered to watch. Margaret stood on her front porch with a self-satisfied look, arms crossed as if she had just won a victory. But when the officers walked past her house and straight to the HOA office, her expression changed. The officers spoke with the HOA treasurer, a nervous-looking man named Carl who had barely spoken at any of the meetings. He handed them a stack of papers, his hands shaking slightly. After reviewing the documents, one of the officers stepped outside and called Margaret over. She hesitated but eventually marched over, trying to maintain her usual air of authority. The officer asked her about the unauthorized fines and accusations of financial mismanagement. Margaret's confident demeanor cracked as she stammered out an excuse, claiming everything was legitimate. Then the officer asked about the HOA's financial records, specifically where the money from all the fines had been going. Carl chimed in, his voice shaky but determined. He admitted that Margaret had been the sole person handling certain accounts that didn't match the HOA's official budget reports. That was the final nail in the coffin. One of the officers informed Margaret that they would be conducting a full audit of the HOA's financials. If anything illegal was found, she could face charges. Margaret's face drained of color. For the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, she looked genuinely afraid. The officers left after informing Carl that he would need to provide full financial transparency to the HOA members. Margaret, meanwhile, stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. By the end of the week, the petition had enough signatures to force a vote. Margaret was officially removed as HOA president. Carl, likely trying to save himself, agreed to cooperate with the investigation. It turned out that Margaret had been funneling HOA funds into a personal account, disguising it under maintenance fees. She was arrested within a month. The HOA, now under new leadership, reversed all the bogus fines and promised full transparency moving forward. The neighborhood finally had its peace back. As for me, I planted a new tree right where the old one had been. This time, no one would dare touch it. With Margaret out of the picture and the HOA undergoing a complete overhaul, the neighborhood was finally beginning to feel like a place people could actually enjoy living in. The atmosphere had shifted where there had been tension and unspoken frustrations. Now there were casual conversations between neighbors, shared laughs, and an unspoken sense of victory. But just because Margaret was gone didn't mean everything was magically fixed overnight. The mess she had left behind was deeper than anyone had realized. The HOA's finances were still under scrutiny, and Carl, the now reluctant treasurer, had been scrambling to put together reports for the investigation. While Margaret had been the ringleader, it was clear that some board members had enabled her, either out of fear or because they had been benefiting from the corruption. James had advised me to keep an eye on any remaining board members who had supported Margaret's decisions without question. Just because they had been quieter didn't mean they weren't complicit. The last thing we needed was someone stepping into Margaret's spot and trying to claw back the power she had lost. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was thick. A temporary president had been appointed, a woman named Linda, who had mostly kept to herself before Margaret's downfall. She seemed nervous addressing the room, but at least she was making an effort to be transparent. She started by acknowledging the unauthorized tree removal had been a serious violation, and that steps were being taken to ensure nothing like that would happen again. Then she moved on to the financials. Carl stood, clearing his throat as he opened a folder filled with documents. He looked exhausted, probably from spending the last few weeks trying to untangle the mess Margaret had left behind. He admitted that a large portion of the HOA's funds had been misallocated and that they were working to track down exactly where the money had gone. That was when things got interesting. One of the homeowners, a retired accountant named Mr. Holloway, had been reviewing the financial reports along with Carl. He spoke up, revealing that some of the funds had been used to pay for unauthorized services, including the tree removal company that had cut down my tree. But that wasn't the shocking part. The real bombshell was that the company who had done the job wasn't just any random contractor. It was owned by Margaret's nephew. A murmur spread across the room. People exchanged looks of disbelief, some shaking their heads in frustration. Margaret hadn't just abused her power, she had been funneling money to her own family under the guise of necessary HOA expenses. One of the longtime residents, Mrs. Delgado, shook her head and muttered that it was no wonder Margaret had been so insistent on getting me to pay for the removal. She had probably been hoping I wouldn't look too closely at the details so that her little scheme would go unnoticed. Linda, looking more overwhelmed by the second, assured everyone that the HOA would be pursuing legal action to recover the stolen funds. But that wasn't enough for some of the homeowners. Several people were already discussing the possibility of a civil lawsuit against Margaret, wanting to make sure she was held accountable for every cent she had stolen. In the middle of the chaos, I leaned back in my chair, watching as the same people who had once been afraid to speak out were now openly demanding justice. It was refreshing. But it also made me wonder just how deep did Margaret's corruption go. After the meeting, I caught up with Mr. Holloway and Carl, asking if they had found anything else suspicious in the records. Carl hesitated before admitting that there were still a lot of unexplained transactions. Some payments had been made to businesses with no clear connection to the HOA, and others had been marked as community improvements despite no actual work being done. That set off alarm bells in my mind. If Margaret had been siphoning money for years, there was a good chance she hadn't been working alone. Someone had to have been helping her cover it up, or at the very least, looking the other way. The problem was figuring out who. Over the next few days, I started digging deeper. I reached out to a few neighbors who had been around longer than me, asking if they had ever noticed anything suspicious before. Some admitted that they had always felt like the HOA's financial decisions were a little too secretive, but they had never thought to question it. Others shrugged, saying they had assumed Margaret was just another overbearing HOA president, not an outright fraudster. Then I got a call from Lisa, the reporter who had covered the initial scandal. She had been following up on the HOA's financial audit and had uncovered something that made my stomach twist. There was another account linked to the HOA one that hadn't been disclosed in the official reports. It had been set up under a different name, but the funds had been coming from HOA dues, and the person managing it. Not Margaret. It was one of the other board members. A man named Richard. Richard had always been one of Margaret's biggest supporters, rarely speaking at meetings, but always voting in favor of her decisions. He had kept a low profile during her downfall, probably hoping to escape scrutiny. But now, it was clear he had been involved in more than just silent compliance. Lisa agreed to pass the information along to the authorities, and within a few days, the police were back in the neighborhood. This time, they weren't knocking on Margaret's door. They were knocking on Richard's. The sight of him being escorted out of his house, looking pale and shaken, was almost surreal. The neighborhood had already gone through one major scandal, and now here was another. People gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves as the officers loaded Richard into the back of a squad car. Later that evening, Carl confirmed that Richard had been using the secret account to funnel HOA money into personal projects, including renovations on a vacation home he owned out of state. It seemed Margaret hadn't been the only one profiting from the HOA's corruption. With Richard out of the picture and the investigation expanding, it became clear that the HOA was going to need a complete restructuring. The remaining board members who had blindly followed Margaret's lead either resigned or were voted out in the next meeting. For the first time in years, the HOA was entirely in the hands of people who actually cared about the community rather than their own personal gain. And with that, the neighborhood finally started to rebuild not just physically, but as a community. The shift was noticeable. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other. The paranoia that had hung in the air under Margaret's rule was gone. As for me, I took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I had played a role in bringing it all crashing down. Margaret had thought she could get away with cutting down my tree and making me pay for it. Instead, it had led to the complete unraveling of everything she had built. With Richard's arrest shaking the neighborhood yet again, it was clear that the corruption within the HOA had been even worse than anyone had imagined. The residents, who had once been too afraid to challenge the board's authority, were now in full revolt. The last few remaining board members, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, resigned almost immediately. That left a power vacuum, and for the first time in years, the homeowners had a real chance to rebuild the HOA from the ground up. But that also meant someone had to step up and take charge. A week after Richard's arrest, a community meeting was held in the same clubhouse where Margaret had once ruled with an iron fist. The turnout was massive. People who had never attended an HOA meeting before now sat in folding chairs, eager to make sure the new leadership wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Linda, still serving as the interim president, stood at the front of the room, looking far more composed than she had at prior meetings. She laid out the agenda, electing a new board, reviewing the HOA's finances in detail, and addressing the concerns of homeowners who had been unfairly fined under Margaret's leadership. The moment she opened the floor for nominations, hands shot up. People wanted leadership they could trust, and they weren't about to let another Margaret or Richard take control. One of the first names put forward was Mrs. Patel, who had been one of the most vocal critics of the old regime. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had seen firsthand how the HOA had changed under Margaret's control. She accepted the nomination with a determined nod. Then, to my surprise, someone nominated me. I hadn't considered running for the board. I had been perfectly happy exposing the corruption and making sure justice was served, but actually managing the HOA, that was an entirely different responsibility. I hesitated, but then I looked around the room. These were my neighbors, people who had been bullied and manipulated for years. If I didn't step up, who would? I agreed, and the meeting moved forward with a vote. By the end of the night, the new HOA board was in place. Linda was officially elected as president, with Mrs. Patel as vice president. I was voted in as secretary, a role that involved documenting meetings, ensuring transparency, and keeping records of all HOA activities. It wasn't the kind of position that held much power, but it was exactly where I wanted to be, watching everything closely to make sure nothing like Margaret's reign ever happened again. With the leadership settled, the next order of business was addressing the financial mess left behind. Carl, still looking exhausted but significantly less anxious now that the worst was over, presented the latest findings. The HOA's budget had been completely mismanaged. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into unauthorized accounts, and even after Margaret and Richard had been taken down, there were still gaps in the records. Some payments had no clear documentation, meaning there could be even more money missing than initially thought. The room filled with murmurs as people processed just how much damage had been done. Homeowners had been paying dues for years, believing that money was going toward community improvements, only to find out it had been lining the pockets of corrupt board members. Linda assured everyone that a forensic audit was underway to track down every missing dollar. In the meantime, all fines issued under Margaret's leadership were being reviewed, and any that were deemed unjustified would be refunded. That announcement was met with a round of applause. Then someone in the back of the room stood up and asked the question that had been lingering in everyone's minds. What would happen to Margaret now? As far as legal consequences went, she was still facing charges for financial misconduct. Richard's arrest had only worsened her situation, as investigators had found evidence linking the two of them in multiple fraudulent transactions. She hadn't been arrested yet, but it was only a matter of time before the authorities decided whether to press additional charges. In the meantime, Margaret had gone into hiding. Her once frequent appearances at the clubhouse or during neighborhood inspections had ceased completely. Her house, which had once been the central hub for her HOA operations, now had the curtains drawn at all hours. Some neighbors had spotted her sneaking out late at night to avoid running into anyone, but beyond that, she had become a ghost. It was a fitting end for someone who had spent years lording over the community. With the meeting adjourned and a new sense of hope in the air, I walked home feeling lighter than I had in months. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done to repair the damage Margaret had caused, but for the first time, it felt like real change was happening. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected knock at my door. When I opened it, I found Lisa, the reporter, standing there with a determined look in her eyes. She wasted no time getting to the point. She had received a tip that Margaret was planning to leave town. Apparently, someone close to her had leaked that she was trying to sell her house quietly, likely to avoid facing the full consequences of the investigation. If she managed to disappear before the authorities could act, she might get away with everything she had done. I didn't need to think twice about what needed to be done next. I called James and filled him in. He agreed that if Margaret was trying to flee, the authorities needed to be informed immediately. He contacted the investigators handling the case, ensuring they were aware of her plans. Hours later, a police car was parked outside her house. Officers knocked on her door, and after a long pause, she finally opened it. She looked disheveled, a far cry from the perfectly put-together woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron grip. The officers handed her legal documents, likely informing her that she was now officially under investigation and would need to remain available for questioning. The neighborhood watched as she stood in her doorway, clutching the papers with shaking hands. She had spent years forcing people to follow her rules, threatening them with fines and legal action. Now it was her turn to face the consequences. It was poetic justice. With Margaret's escape plan foiled, the last remnants of her influence crumbled. The community, once fractured and afraid, had come together to take back control. The HOA, now under honest leadership, was finally serving the people instead of exploiting them. As for me, I had gone from being just another homeowner to someone who had helped bring down a corrupt system. And I had no regrets. With Margaret cornered and Richard in custody, the last remnants of their corrupt regime were crumbling. The HOA had been drained of funds, the community had lost all faith in its leadership, and the legal consequences were finally catching up to those responsible. But there was still unfinished business. The forensic audit continued, uncovering even more financial discrepancies. Some transactions were traced to businesses that didn't exist, while others led to accounts that had been hastily closed in the days following Margaret's downfall. The deeper investigators dug, the worse it got. It was no longer just about mismanaged funds, it was now a full-scale fraud case. Lisa, the reporter, kept me updated on the legal proceedings. Margaret had been ordered not to leave town, but she was still trying to maneuver her way out of the mess. She had hired an attorney, one who was known for defending white-collar criminals, and was reportedly planning to fight the charges, but with the mounting evidence against her, it was a losing battle. Meanwhile, the new HOA board was working to repair the damage done. Linda had already begun implementing new rules to ensure no single person could control the finances again. A third-party accounting firm had been hired to oversee transactions, and a requirement was put in place for all major financial decisions to be approved by a majority vote. Transparency was the new priority. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined under Margaret's rule started receiving refunds. The community, once wary and distrustful, was slowly regaining confidence. A few residents even volunteered to help with maintenance projects that had been neglected, repainting fences and repairing sidewalks that had been ignored for years. Despite the progress, Margaret still had her loyalists, though they were fewer by the day. A handful of residents who had benefited from her favoritism tried to argue that the investigations were an overreach, that Margaret had only been doing what was best for the community. But their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming majority who had suffered under her rule. Then something unexpected happened. A man in a suit showed up at my door one afternoon, holding a folder under his arm. He introduced himself as a legal representative handling the HOA's civil claims and said he wanted to speak with me about the tree removal incident. At first, I assumed he was just following up on paperwork, but as we talked, he revealed something that caught me off guard. The tree removal company, the one Margaret had hired without permission, had come forward with new information. They admitted that Margaret had instructed them to cut down multiple trees in the neighborhood, claiming she had full authority to do so. And not just any trees, the most prominent, well-established ones. The reason? She had been negotiating a deal with a landscaping company that specialized in high-end redesigns. She had planned to have the entire neighborhood's greenery torn out and replaced with more uniform landscaping, which of course would have been paid for through increased HOA fees. But before she could implement her plan, the investigation had shut everything down. I asked the representative what this meant for my case, and he said the HOA was now offering a formal settlement. They were prepared to compensate me not just for the tree removal, but also for the legal trouble I had endured in fighting Margaret's nonsense. I told him I'd think about it. That evening, I met with James to go over the offer. He reviewed the terms and agreed that it was fair, but he also pointed out that I had leverage. The HOA was desperate to clean up its reputation, and the last thing they wanted was another lawsuit drawing more negative attention. So I made a counteroffer. In addition to financial compensation, I wanted the HOA to formally acknowledge their wrongdoing in a community-wide announcement. I wanted homeowners to know exactly what had happened, who had been responsible, and what was being done to prevent it from happening again. The board agreed. A few days later, a letter was sent to every homeowner in the community. It detailed the corruption that had been uncovered, the fraudulent transactions, and the illegal tree removals. It also included an apology from the new leadership, along with assurances that new policies were being put in place to prevent future abuse of power. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Homeowners appreciated the honesty, and more people started attending meetings, eager to be involved in shaping the community's future. Margaret, on the other hand, had gone completely silent. With her influence gone and her legal troubles piling up, she had no more moves left to play. Then the final blow came. A few weeks later, Lisa called me with an update. The financial audit had uncovered something that sealed Margaret's fate for good. She had been embezzling money for years, but the most damning discovery was that she had used HOA funds to pay off personal debts. She had funneled thousands into a private account, covering everything from credit card payments to luxury purchases. With this new evidence, law enforcement had enough to move forward. Margaret was arrested at her home early one morning. Officers arrived with a warrant, and this time there was no escaping the consequences. Neighbors watched from their porches as she was escorted into a patrol car, her face pale and expressionless. The woman who had spent years terrorizing homeowners with fines and threats was now the one facing legal repercussions. As the police car pulled away, a sense of finality settled over the neighborhood. Margaret was gone. Richard was already behind bars. The HOA had been rebuilt. Justice had been served. The community had won. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Without the constant fear of HOA overreach, people actually started enjoying their homes again. One afternoon, as I stood outside admiring the new tree I had planted, Mrs. Patel walked over with a smile. She said she had never seen the neighborhood so united before, and it was all because people had finally stood up to the corruption. I nodded, knowing that she was right. Margaret had thought she could control everything. She had believed she was untouchable. But in the end, the truth had caught up to her. And the neighborhood would never be the same again.